getting a little crowded out here. I'm going to try to get this going before, get it uploaded before anything happens, if it should happen. Trying to share some room with a generator out here. We're getting ready, or it's calling for freezing rain and whatnot, ice, and power goes out here quite often for absolutely nothing. So here we go. Let the fun begin. This is going to be Anti-Federalist number 18 through 20. What does history teach? This is part 1. An old Whig, taken from the Massachusetts Gazette, November 27, 1787, as reprinted from the Philadelphia Independent Gazetteer. By the proposed Constitution, every law, before it passes, is to undergo repeated revisions, and the Constitution of every state in the Union provide for the revision of the most trifling laws, either by their passing through different houses of Assembly and Senate, or by requiring them to be published for the consideration of the people. Why then is a Constitution which affects all the inhabitants of the United States, which is to be the foundation of all laws and the source of misery or happiness to 1/4 of the globe, why is this to be so hastily adopted or rejected that it cannot admit of a revision? If a law to regulate highways requires to be leisurely considered and undergo the examination of different bodies of men, one after another, before it be passed, why is it that the framing of a constitution for the government of a great people, a work which has been justly considered as the greatest effort of human genius, and from which, from the beginning of the world, has so often baffled the skill of the wisest men in every age, shall be considered as a thing to be thrown out in the first shape which it may happen to assume? Where is not the people still their own masters? If, when the several state conventions come to consider this Constitution, they should not approve of it in its present form, they may easily apply to Congress and state their objections. Congress may as easily direct the calling another convention as they did the calling of the last. The plan may then be reconsidered, deliberately received and corrected, so as to meet the appropriation of every friend to this country. A few months only will be necessary for this purpose, and if we consider the magnitude of the object, we shall deem it well worth a little time and attention. It is much better to pause and reflect beforehand than to repent when it's too late, when no peaceable remedy will be left us, and unanimity will be forever banished. The struggles of the people against a bad government, when it is once fixed, afford but a gloomy picture in the annals of mankind. They are often unfortunate. They are always destructive of private and public happiness. But the peaceable consent of the people to establish a free and effective government is one of the most glorious objects that is ever exhibited on the theater of human affairs. Some, I know, have objected that another convention will not be likely to agree upon anything. I am far, however, from being of that opinion. The public voice calls so loudly for a new constitution that I have no doubt we shall have one of some sort. My only fear is that the impatience of the people will lead them to accept the first that is offered them without examining whether it is right or wrong. And after all, if a new convention cannot agree upon any amendments in the Constitution which is at present proposed, we could still adopt this in its present form, and all further opposition being vain, it is to be hoped we shall be unanimous in endeavoring to make the best of it. The experiment is at least worth trying, and I shall be much astonished if a new convention called together for the purpose of revising the proposed Constitution do not greatly reform it. It is beyond a doubt that the new federal Constitution, if adopted, will in a great measure destroy, if it does not totally annihilate, the separate governments of the several states. We shall, in effect, become one great republic. Every measure of any importance will be continental. What will be the consequence of this? One thing is evident, that no republic of so great magnitude ever did or ever can exist. But if a few years elapse from the time in which ancient Rome extended her dominions beyond the bounds of Italy until the downfall of her people, and all political writers agree that a republican government can exist only in a narrow territory, but a confederacy of different republics has, in many instances, existed and flourished for a long time together. The celebrated Helvetian League, which exists at this moment in full vigor and with unimpaired strength, while its origin may be traced to the confines of antiquity, is one among many examples on this head, and at the same time furnishes an eminent proof of how much less importance it is that the constituent parts of a confederacy of republics may be rightly framed than it is that the confederacy itself should be rightly organized. For hardly any two of the Swiss cantons have the same form of government, and they are almost equally divided in their religious principles, which have so often rent asunder the firmest establishments. A confederacy of republics must be the establishment in America, or we must cease altogether to retain the republican form of government. From the moment we become one great republic, either in form or substance, the period is very shortly removed when we shall sink first into monarchy and then into despotism. If the men who, at different times, have been entrusted to form plans of government for the world had been really actuated by no other motives than the public good, the condition of human nature in all ages would have been widely different from that which has been exhibited to us in history. In this country, perhaps, we are possessed of more than our share of political virtue. If we will exercise a little patience and bestow our best endeavors on the business, I do not think it impossible that we may yet form a federal constitution much superior to any form of government which has ever existed in the world. But whenever this important work shall be accomplished, I venture to pronounce that it will not be done without a careful attention to the framing of a Bill of Rights. In different nations, we find different grants or reservations of privileges appealed to in the struggles between the rulers and the people, many of which, in the different nations of Europe, have long since been swallowed up and lost by time, or destroyed by the arbitrary hand of power. In England, we find the people, with the barons at their head, exacting a solemn resignation of their rights from King John in their celebrated Magna Carta, which was many times renewed in Parliament during the reigns of his successors. The Petition of Rights was afterwards consented to by Charles I and contained a declaration of the liberties of the people. The Habeas Corpus Act, after the restoration of Charles II, the Bill of Rights, which was obtained of the Prince and Princess of Orange, and on their accession to the throne, and the Act of Settlement at the accession of the Hanover family, are other instances to show the care and watchfulness of what nation to improve every opportunity of the reign of a weak prince or the revolution in their government to obtain the most explicit declarations in favor of their liberties. In like manner, the people of this country, in the Revolution, having all power in their own hands, in forming the constitutions of the several states, took care to secure themselves by Bill of Rights, so as to prevent as far as possible the encroachments of their future rulers upon the rights of the people. Some of these rights are said to be inalienable, such as the rights of conscience. Yet even these have often been invaded where they have not been carefully secured by express and solemn bills and declarations in their favor. Before we establish a government whose acts will be supreme law of the land and whose power will extend to almost every case without exception, we ought carefully to guard ourselves by a Bill of Rights against the invasion of those liberties which it is essential for us to retain, which is of no real use for government to deprive us of, but which, in the course of human events, have been too often insulted with all the wantonness of an idle barbarity. An Old Whig. Anti-Federalist number 18 through 20. What does history teach? Part 2. A Newport man wrote this wit, which appeared in the Newport Mercury, March 17th, 1788. I perceive in your last issue a piece signed A Rhode Island Man. It seems wrote with an air of confidence and triumph. He speaks of reason and reasoning. I wish he had known or practiced some of that reasoning, so he so much pretends to. His essay had been much shorter. We are told in this piece, as well as others on the same side, that an ability given to British subjects to recover their debts in this country will be one of the blessings of a new government, by inducing the British to abandon the frontiers or be left without excuse. But the British have no other reason for holding the posts after the time named in the treaty for their evacuation than the last reason of kings, that is, their guns. And giving them the treasure of the United States is a very unlikely means of removing that. If the British subject met with legal impediments to the recovery of his debts in this country, for the British government to have put the same stop on our citizens would have been proper and ample retaliation. But there is nothing within compass of possibility of which I am not perfectly sure, that I am more fully persuaded of than I am, that the British will never relinquish the posts in question until compelled by force, because no nation pays less regard to the faith of treaties than the British. Witness their conduct to the French in 1755, when they took a very great number of men of war and merchant ships before war was declared, because the French had some forts on the south side of an imaginary line in the wilds of America, and again, the violation of the articles by which the people of Boston resigned their arms, and the violation of the capitulation of Charlestown. Again, we are told that Congress has no credit with foreigners because they have no power to fulfill their engagements. And this we are told with a boldness exceeded by nothing but its falsehood, perhaps the same paper that announces to the world the loan of 1 million of Holland guilders, if I mistake not, a sum equal to 250,000 Spanish dollars, and all of this done by the procurement of that very Congress whose insignificancy and want of power had been constantly proclaimed for 2 or 3 years before. The Dutch are most cautious people on earth, and it is reasonable to suppose they were apparently persuaded of the permanency and efficiency of our government by their risking so much money on it. We are told so long as we withhold this power from Congress, we shall be a weak, despised people. We are long contending for independence, and now we are in passion to be rid of it. But let us attempt to reason on this subject, and see to which side that will lead us. Reason is truly defined, in all cases short of mathematical demonstration, to be a supposing that the like causes will produce the like effects. Let us proceed by this rule. The Swiss cantons for 100 years have remained separate independent states, consequently without any controlling power. Even the little republic of St. Marino, containing perhaps but little more ground than the town of Newport and about 5,000 inhabitants, surrounded by powerful and ambitious neighbors, has kept its freedom and independence these 1,300 years. And it is mentioned by travelers as a very enlightened and happy people. If these small republics in the neighborhood of the warlike and intriguing courts of Paris, Vienna, and Berlin have kept their freedom and original form of government, it is not reasonable to suppose the same good sense and love of freedom on this side of the Atlantic will secure us from all attempts within and without. That has happened in Switzerland was on a religious account, and a supreme controlling power is no security against this, as appears by what happened in Ireland at the same time of Charles I, and in France in the time of Henry IV. It seems rational in a case of this importance to consult the opinion of the ablest men, and to whom can we better appeal than to J.J. Rossino, a Republican by birth and education, one of the most exalted geniuses and one of the greatest writers of his age, or perhaps any age, a man the most disinterested and benevolent towards mankind, a man who the most industrious in the acquisition of knowledge and information by travel, conversation, reading, and thinking, and one who has wrote a volume of governments entitled The Social Contract, wherein he inculcates that the people should examine and determine every public act themselves. His words are that every law that the people have not ratified in person is void. It is no law. The people of England think they are free. They are much mistaken. They are never but so during the election of members of Parliament. As soon as they are elected, they are slaves. They are nothing. And by the use they make of their liberty during the short moments they possess it, they will deserve to lose it. This is far from advising that 30,000 souls should resign their judgments and wishes entirely to one man for 2 years, to a man who perhaps may go from home sincere and patriotic, but by the time he has dined in pomp for a week with the wealthy citizens of New York or Philadelphia, will have lost all his rigid ideas of economy and equality. He becomes fascinated with the elegances and luxuries of wealth. Objects and intimidations like these soon change the champion for the people to an advocate for power, and the people, finding themselves thus basely betrayed, cry that virtue is but a name. We are not sure that men have more virtue at this time and place than they had in England in the time of George II. Let anyone look into the history of those times and see with what boldness men changed sides and deserted the people in pursuit of profit and power. If to take up the cross and renounce the pomps and vanities of this sinful world is a hard lesson for divines, 'tis much harder for politicians. A Cincinnatus, a Cato, a Fabricius, and a Washington are rarely to be found. We are told that the trustees of our powers and freedom, being mostly married men, and all of them inhabitants and proprietors of the country, is an ample security against an abuse of power. Whether human nature be less corrupt than formerly, I will not determine, but this I know, that Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, and the nobles of Venice were natives and inhabitants of the countries whose power they usurped and drenched in blood. Again, our country is compared to a ship of which we are all passengers, and from thence 'tis gravely concluded that no officer can ever betray or abuse this trust, but that men will sacrifice the public to their private interests is a saying too well known to need repeating. And the instances of designed shipwrecks and ships run away with by a combination of masters, supercargoes, and part owners is so great that nothing can equal them, but those instances in which pretended patriots and politicians have raised themselves and families to power and greatness by destroying that freedom and those laws they were chosen to defend. If it were necessary to cite more precedents to prove that the people ought not to trust or remove their power any further from them, the little republic of Lucia may be mentioned, which, surrounded by the dukedom of Tuscany and existed under its present constitution about 500 years, and as Mr. Addison says, is for the extent of its dominion the richest and best peopled of all the states of Italy. And he says further that the whole administration of the government passes into different hands every 2 months. This is very far from confirming the doctrine of choosing those officers for 2 years who were before chosen for 1. The want of a decisive, efficient power is much talked of by the discontented, and that we are in danger of being conquered by the intrigues of European powers. But it has already been shown that we have delegated a more decisive power to our Congress than is granted by the Republic, Swiss cantons to their General Diet. These republicans have enjoyed peace some hundreds of years, while those governments which possess this decisive, efficient power so much aimed at are as often as 20 or 30 years drawing their men from the plow and the loom to be shot at and cut each other's throats for the honor of their respective nations. And now, much further we are from Europe than the Swiss cantons with their allies, and Lucia and Saint Marino are from France, Prussia, and Austria. By so much less we are in danger of being conquered than those republics which have existed, some earlier than others, but the youngest of them 130 years, without being conquered. As for the United Provinces of Holland, they are but nominal republics, their stadtholder very much like our intended president, making them in reality a monarchy and subject to all its calamities. But supposing that the present Constitution, penned by the ablest men, 4 or 5 years in completion, and its adoption considered as the happiest event, supposing, I say, the present Constitution destroyed, can a new one be ratified with more agreed to in stronger or more binding terms? What security can be given that in 7 years hence another convention shall not be called to frame a third constitution? And as ancient Greece counted by Olympiads the monarchies by their kings' reigns, we shall date in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd year of the 7th, 8th, or 9th Constitution. In treating this subject, I have not presumed to advise, and have intruded but few comments. I have mentioned the state of those countries which most resemble our own, and leave to the natural sense of the reader to make his own conclusions. The malcontents, the lovers of novelty, delight much in allegory. Should I be indulged a few words in that way, I should not compare the new Constitution to a house. I shall fetch my simile from the country and compare it to Siberian wheat, otherwise called Siberian sheep, which is known to have been the most praised, the most dear, the most worthless, and the most short-lived thing that was ever adopted. But if the free men of this continent are weary of that power and freedom they have so dearly bought and so shortly enjoyed, the power of judging and determining what laws are most wholesome, what taxes are requisite and sufficient, I say. If the people are tired of these privileges, now is the time to part with them forever. Much more might be said to show the bitterness and mischief contained in this gilded pill, but being fond of brevity, I shall rely on the good sense of the public to keep themselves out of the trap, and sign myself in plain English, a Newport man. Little more things to think about. I'll try to be back tomorrow. It all depends, what form. I'm gonna hunker in now, get things ready. It's already starting to mix with wet stuff, so we're gonna have some icing tonight. Peace out, all.